over the moon with that woman.
I will be his #1 fan, cheering him on for the rest of this lifetime, so.
After 10 years of marriage, Jelly Roll and Bunnie XO are going their separate ways.
When word spread that Jelly Roll and Bunnie XO were calling it quits after very close to a decade together, the reaction online was one of genuine disbelief, because this was a marriage that had already survived almost everything two people can throw at a relationship. From a painful affair to a long separation, a slow and deliberate rebuilding of trust, a public vow renewal, and even an emotional, openly discussed push toward having a child through surrogacy. So the question everyone kept asking was simple. If they had already made it through the worst chapter imaginable, what finally pulled them apart now? And the truth, based on what has actually come out, turns out to be far less dramatic and far more human than fans expected. Long before stadiums and Grammy wins, Jason DeFord, the man the world knows as Jelly Roll, was grinding through small, half-empty venues, broke, uncertain, and quietly carrying the weight of a chaotic past. And it was in that unglamorous stretch of his life, around 2015, that he crossed paths with Elisa DeFord, better known as Bunnie XO, at one of his shows in Las Vegas. She wasn't meeting a star. She was meeting a struggling artist with real scars. And by her own account, she'd had a rough road of her own, having spent years working in the adult industry before eventually stepping away from it years into their marriage. What started as a connection in Vegas turned romantic the following year, and rather than taking things slow, the two moved quickly, marrying in August 2016, not long after they'd really gotten to know one another. Bunnie has since been candid that theirs was never meant to look like a conventional storybook romance, describing herself and Jelly Roll as two people who came from rough, unfiltered backgrounds rather than picture-perfect beginnings. And that honesty became something fans came to respect about them. Bunnie also became a steady presence in the life of Jelly Roll's daughter, Bailey, helping him fight for custody and stepping into a stepmother role he has credited her for taking on with real devotion. And he's spoken publicly, including emotionally on stage at the 2026 Grammys, about how much her belief in him meant during the years when his career was still nothing more than a long shot. But the marriage was tested early and hard. Around 2018, just 2 years in, Bunnie discovered that Jelly Roll had been unfaithful, an affair that, according to what she later wrote in her memoir, stripped down, unfiltered and unapologetic, she'd suspected for roughly 10 months before getting confirmation from a friend close to the situation. The fallout was severe enough that she moved out and went back to Las Vegas. And for a stretch of time, it genuinely looked like the marriage might not survive its own second year. Jelly Roll didn't deny what happened. In later interviews, including a 2025 appearance on the Human School podcast, he openly admitted to the affair and called it one of the worst moments of his adult life, taking responsibility rather than trying to minimize it. What followed wasn't a quick patch-up. It took real time, hard conversations, and a willingness from both of them to sit with the discomfort of rebuilding something that had been badly broken. And slowly, trust came back into the relationship. Not all at once, but piece by piece. By 2023, the two felt like they'd reached solid enough ground to renew their vows. A moment that carried far more weight than a typical anniversary celebration, because it was effectively a public statement that they'd chosen each other again, with full knowledge of what had gone wrong before. Around that same period, their conversations turned toward expanding their family, and they spoke openly, including on Bunnie's Dumb Blonde podcast and across social media, about pursuing IVF and surrogacy, with Bunnie explaining that carrying a pregnancy herself wasn't something her body could safely do, so they began looking into a surrogate and even hoped for twins. As recently as her February 2026 memoir, Bunnie gave fans an update suggesting they'd found a surrogate and were still hopeful about welcoming a child together. And just months before announcing the split, in a November 2025 episode of her podcast, she talked about leaving the outcome in God's hands and being at peace either pursuing surrogacy further or eventually adopting if that path didn't work out. None of this reads like a couple quietly drifting toward the exit. At the same time, Jelly Roll's career was accelerating at a pace that matched the emotional intensity of his personal life. Going from small-town gigs to packed arenas, major label recognition, and eventually a Grammy win for Best Contemporary Country Album for Beautifully Broken. At the 2026 ceremony in February, just months before the divorce filing became public. Through that rise, Bunnie was consistently visible as his most vocal supporter, defending him against online criticism and standing by him through his dramatic weight loss journey, in which he lost close to 300 pounds, with Jelly Roll repeatedly crediting her, sometimes saying she essentially saved his life for helping him stay grounded as fame intensified. The two were even seen showing affection on the red carpet at the 2026 Grammys, just months before news of the filing broke, which is part of why the announcement landed as such a shock to fans who'd been following them. According to court records out of Williamson County, Tennessee, Jelly Roll filed for divorce in May 2026, with the documents listing May 9 as the date of separation and citing irreconcilable differences, a filing that came roughly 2 months before what would have been their 10th wedding anniversary in August. Sources close to the situation described the decision as a mutual one and emphasized that, despite the public's hunger for a scandal, this wasn't framed as the result of a new betrayal, but rather as something the two of them arrived at together. Reports also noted that things moved fast once the filing became public, with a moving truck spotted outside their Tennessee home in the days that followed. Jelly Roll's 18-year-old daughter Bailey addressed the situation herself on TikTok, expressing frustration at how much public attention was being directed at what she called a clearly private family matter. A reminder that behind the headlines there are real people, including kids, navigating this. There was also a small wave of confusion when Jelly Roll posted a TikTok in early June featuring photos of himself and Bailey set to his song, Mama, posted weeks after the listed separation date, which some fans speculated was some kind of statement on the split, prompting him to clarify what he meant by it rather than let the speculation run unchecked. So if the affair, the very thing that nearly ended things back in 2018, wasn't ultimately what caused this divorce, what was it? Based on everything that's actually been said publicly, the most accurate answer isn't a single explosive secret, but something far more ordinary, and, in a way, more painful precisely because it's so common. Two people who built their entire identity as a couple around surviving crisis after crisis simply grew, changed, and evolved in ways that no longer lined up the same way they once did. The version of Jason DeFord who married Alisa in a relatively quick Vegas-rooted romance in 2016 was a struggling, uncertain artist still finding his footing, and the version of him standing on a Grammy stage in 2026 thanking his wife is, by any reasonable measure, an entirely different person, shaped by years of fame, transformation, sobriety work, and constant public scrutiny. Bunnie, too, went through her own significant transformation during this marriage, stepping away from her former career, becoming a stepmother, building a major podcast and personal brand of her own, and writing a memoir that required her to revisit and process some of the most painful chapters of her life in detail. Growth like that doesn't automatically break a relationship, and for years it didn't break theirs. If anything, the years right after the affair are often described as the period when they were most intentional about choosing each other. But it's entirely possible, and based on the language both of them and people close to them have used, it appears likely that the very growth that helped each of them individually eventually created distance between them as a couple, not because either person did something newly wrong, but because the version of partnership they once needed from one another shifted as their individual lives expanded. That's a much less satisfying story for headlines than another affair or some hidden scandal. But it tends to be a more honest explanation for why long marriages that have already survived real crises sometimes still end, not with a single dramatic rupture, but with two people slowly realizing that the paths they're each walking, even while still caring about one another, no longer point in exactly the same direction. As of now, neither Jelly Roll nor Bunnie XO has given a detailed public breakdown of exactly what changed in these final months. and representatives for both have largely declined to comment beyond confirming the filing, so a lot of what's circulating remains speculation, pieced together from old interviews, podcast clips, and court paperwork, rather than a definitive statement from either of them. What is clear is that this wasn't a relationship that ended quietly or without a fight for survival. These two had already proven, through one of the harder tests a marriage can face, that they were willing to do the work of staying together. That history is exactly why the ending feels so unresolved to so many people who followed their story, because it doesn't fit the usual pattern of celebrity splits driven by an obvious betrayal or a single bad headline. Whether there's any future where the two reconcile, the way they did once before after the 2018 affair, remains an open question that neither has addressed directly, and for now, what's left is a divorce filing, a quiet acknowledgement from both sides that not much more will be said publicly, and a fan base left trying to reconcile the image of a couple who once stood